In the scorching summer of 1935, beneath the crimson walls of Rajgarh Fort, a scream shattered the sultry night. The priceless Maharaja's ruby, blood-red, cursed, the size of a pigeon's egg, had vanished from the throat of its royal owner. His Highness Maharaja Vikram Singh was found at dawn in the locked Diwani Khas, a jewelled dagger buried in his heart. The great doors bolted from within, every window barred by ancient iron lattice. No footprints in the dust, no secret passage. Only the lingering scent of attar of roses and death. Hercule Poirot, on holiday in Simla, received a telegram that would drag the little Belgian into the most impossible crime of his career. Chapter 1. The Telegram from Rajgarh. The little Belgian sat very upright in a cane chair on the veranda of the Cecil Hotel, Simla, wrapped, despite the fierce Himalayan sun, in a white linen suit and an expression of profound discontent. Hercule Poirot disliked holidays. He disliked the mountains, which offended his sense of order by rising and falling without permission. He disliked the English, who insisted on playing something called tennis, while wearing flannels that clung damply to their knees. Most of all, he disliked the fact that for 9 entire days, no one had been murdered within a radius of 500 miles. It was, he confided to the empty air, an insult to the little grey cells. A barefoot Goanese boy in a scarlet uniform padded across the teak boards and presented a salver bearing a single yellow envelope. Poirot regarded it with the suspicion usually reserved for unexploded bombs. Telegrams in holiday resorts were rarely good news. They were invariably demands from Scotland Yard, or frantic appeals from distressed duchesses who had mislaid their pearls at the wrong dinner party. He slit the envelope with the silver knife he carried for the purpose and unfolded the flimsy paper. The message was in English, typed in the urgent capital letters of the Indian Telegraph Service, to Hercule Poirot, Cecil Hotel, Simla Maharaja, Vikram Singh Rajgarh murdered. Last night stop ruby of Kali stolen. Stop crime impossible. Stop locked room. No entrance, no footprints. Stop come at once. Stop expenses. No object. Stop Lacey. Resident Poirot read it once, twice, a third time. A small, precise smile curved beneath the magnificence of his moustaches. At last the universe had remembered its obligations. Captain Arthur Hastings, late of the Western Front and currently attempting to master the intricacies of the Pahit cocktail under the distant supervision of the barman, observed the transformation with alarm. One moment, Poirot had been a picture of martyred resignation. The next he was positively vibrating with satisfaction, like a terrier that had spotted a particularly promising rat. "Poirot, old chap," Hastings ventured, "you look as if someone has just left you a fortune." "Better than a fortune, mon ami," Poirot replied, waving the telegram like a triumphant banner. "Someone has left me a murder. A murder of the most interesting. A Maharaja, no less, stabbed to death in a locked and bolted room, from which a ruby the size of a pigeon's egg has vanished into thin air. The doors fastened from the inside, the windows barred, no secret passage, no footprints in the dust. It is, in short, impossible, therefore it is irresistible." Hastings set down his glass with the caution of a man who has learned that Poirot in full cry is capable of overlooking small details such as furniture. "Hang on, you're not seriously proposing we dash off to some native state in the middle of the hot weather? The thermometer was 112 in Delhi yesterday." "Yesterday," Poirot said grandly, "is of no importance. Today there is a crime that cries out for Hercule Poirot. Pack, Hastings. We depart on the evening mail to Abu Road, thence by motor to Rajgarh. Colonel Lacey assures me expenses are no object, and I For one, intended to be extremely expensive. Within the hour, the machinery of departure was in motion. Trunks were summoned, accounts settled, porters bullied into unnatural activity by the combined forces of Poirot's imperious French and Hastings' embarrassed English apologies. The little detective moved through the lobby of the Cecil like a ship under full sail, leaving in his wake a trail of bemused memsahibs and one abandoned game of bridge. On the platform at Simla Station, the narrow-gauge toy train waited, its engine puffing importantly. Poirot installed himself in a first-class compartment, already occupied by a stout lady in puce, who was attempting to persuade a pug dog that the Himalayas were no place for asthma. Hastings, laden with baggage that included 2 hat boxes Poirot insisted were essential to civilization, collapsed opposite. As the train began its long switchback descent through pine forests and rhododendron tunnels, Poirot produced the telegram again and studied it with the devotion of a scholar consulting a sacred text. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured, tapping the paper. "The phrase, 'crime impossible.' It is a challenge. It is a gauntlet thrown down before the finest detective mind in Europe. Somewhere in the desert, a murderer believes himself, or perhaps herself, very clever. We shall demonstrate the error of such an assumption." Hastings, who had been attempting to read a dog-eared copy of the Jungle Book, lowered it with a sigh. "I suppose you already have a theory." "A theory? Mon Dieu, no! At this stage, I have only curiosity, vast and insatiable. But consider the elements. A Maharaja, rich, powerful, surrounded by tradition and superstition. A ruby of legendary value, the ruby of Kali, said to be cursed. A locked room, no means of entrance or exit. It has the flavour of the Arabian Nights, yet it occurs in the year 1935 under the nose of the British Raj. Somewhere in this melange of East and West lies the truth." The train lurched around a precipice. Far below, the plains of India shimmered like hammered brass. Poirot folded the telegram with reverence and placed it in the pocket over his heart. "Tell me, Hastings," he said dreamily, "have you ever seen a ruby, the colour of fresh blood, large enough to rest in the palm of a man's hand? They say the ruby of Kali drinks the light and gives nothing back. It has belonged to emperors and courtesans, to priests and murderers. And now it has caused another murder. I confess, I am impatient to make its acquaintance." Night fell as they changed to the broad-gauge express at Kalka. The air grew heavier, laden with the scent of dust and distant wood smoke. Poirot refused the dining car. "English cooking on an Indian railway, non merci," and sustained himself on a tin of pâté de foie gras and a bottle of Vichy water produced from the depths of his dressing case as though by conjuring. At every wayside station, the name Rajgarh seemed to hang in the air like an incantation. Coolies whispered it. A fat Parsi merchant in the next compartment repeated it with relish, clearly anticipating scandal among the native princes. Even the ticket inspector, when he punched their tickets, lingered a moment. "You are going to Rajgarh, Sahib?" he asked in awed Hindi. "Then beware the curse of the bloodstone." Poirot's eyes glittered. "My friend," he replied in flawless Urdu, "I do not believe in curses. I believe in murderers. And murderers, unlike curses, can be caught." Dawn found them descending into the furnace of Rajasthan. The train crawled across a landscape the colour of bone, past villages huddled around wells, past herds of black cattle, tended by women in skirts the shade of flame. Heat pressed against the windows like a living thing. Hastings mopped his face and dreamed of cold beer. At Abu Road, a gleaming Rolls-Royce Phantom II awaited them. Its silver mascot, a leaping tiger. The chauffeur, a Rajput with a turban the size of a small bush, saluted stiffly. "Colonel Lacy Sahib sends his compliments in the car. The road to Rajgarh is long, and the sun is angry." Poirot climbed into the back as though born to the purple. "Drive on, my friend," he commanded. "The sooner we arrive, the sooner Hercule Poirot begins to earn his extremely large fee." As the car swept along the dusty highway, mirage lakes dancing ahead of them, Poirot leaned back against crimson leather and allowed himself a moment of pure, unadulterated pleasure. Somewhere ahead lay a palace of red sandstone, a dead Maharaja, a vanished ruby, and a murderer who believed the perfect crime had been committed. He stroked his moustaches and addressed the empty air with satisfaction. "Impossible?" he murmured. "We shall see about that." Chapter 2. Arrival at the Crimson Palace. The Rolls-Royce climbed the hairpin road to Rajgarh as the sun balanced on the rim of the Aravalli Hills, turning the fort's sandstone walls the exact colour of congealed blood. From a distance, the palace appeared to float above the desert, a mirage of domes and minarets and latticed balconies suspended between earth and sky, until the car swept through the elephant gates, and the illusion shattered into the clamour of mourning drums, and the scent of marigolds crushed under mourning feet. Servants in mourning white scattered as the car hissed across the courtyard. Somewhere a woman wailed in a high, ululating keen that made the hairs rise on Hastings's neck. Poirot, however, merely adjusted the angle of his hat and stepped out with the brisk satisfaction of a man arriving at the theatre 5 minutes before curtain. Colonel Lacy was waiting beneath the vaulted entrance of the Diwan-i-Am, his scarlet tunic dark with sweat, his face the shade of old parchment. The resident was a tall, stooped Englishman of the old school, moustache waxed to bayonet points despite the heat, eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness and something that might have been fear. He shook Poirot's hand with the desperation of a drowning man clutching driftwood. "Thank God you've come," he said, voice cracking like dry leather. "The whole state is on the edge of riot. The priests say the goddess is angry, the palace women are hysterical, and young Amar Singh is already measuring the throne for size. I've got 50 sepoys guarding the Zenana, and another 50 guarding the treasury, and I still don't sleep." Poirot inclined his head with exquisite politeness. "You may sleep now, mon colonel. Hercule Poirot is here, and order will be restored. First, however, I wish to see the body and the room where the impossible became, regrettably, fact." Lacy led them through corridors where mirrors reflected their progress 1,000-fold, past fountains that had ceased to play, beneath chandeliers draped in black muslin like captive widows. Courtiers in mourning turbans pressed against the walls to let them pass, their kohl-rimmed eyes wide with curiosity and dread. Somewhere a parrot screamed an obscenity in Rajasthani and was hastily muffled beneath a velvet cloth. They emerged onto a marble terrace overlooking the desert. Far below, the city of Rajgarh shimmered in the heat, its blue-washed houses huddled around the palace like supplicants. Vultures wheeled above the burning ghat on the distant lake. Poirot paused, drinking in the scene with the appreciation of a connoisseur. "Magnificent," he murmured. "A stage set for tragedy. One feels almost sorry to disturb the tableau with mere detection." Lacy gave a bark of mirthless laughter. "You won't feel that way when you've spent a night listening to the Rani screaming about curses. Come along." The Diwani cars lay at the heart of the palace, a small octagonal chamber designed for the most intimate audiences. Its doors, heavy teak bound with silver, stood ajar. 2 nervous sentries sprang to attention as the colonel approached. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of death and attar of roses. The Maharaja still sat upon his silver throne, head fallen forward, the jewelled dagger buried to its hilt beneath the sternum. His cloth of gold achkan was stiff with dried blood. The great ruby that should have blazed at his throat was gone, leaving only a darker stain against the crimson silk. Poirot stood motionless for a long minute, absorbing every detail with those disconcertingly bright green eyes. Then he moved forward with the neat precision of a watchmaker, noting the position of the body, the angle of the dagger, the absence of blood upon the marble dais, the single crimson rose petal, lying like a fallen drop of blood upon the floor. "Observe, Hastings," he said softly. "The blade entered upward, beneath the ribs, a thrust requiring either great strength or great intimacy. The Maharaja trusted his killer enough to allow such closeness." Hastings swallowed. "Good Lord! And the doors were bolted from within?" "From within," Lacey confirmed hoarsely. "I myself helped break them down at dawn. The windows are latticed iron, 30 feet above the courtyard. No rope, no ladder, no footprints in the dust of the terrace. The guards swear no one passed them all night." Poirot knelt, examining the rose petal with a pocket lens. "Curious. The palace gardens grow only white roses. This is damask, deep red, and fresh." He rose, brushing imaginary dust from his knees. "The ruby, Colonel, describe it to me." Lacey's voice dropped to a whisper, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "The ruby of Cayley, as large as a musket ball, blood red with a black star at its heart. Said to have been pried from the forehead of the goddess herself during the mutiny. Every ruler who wore it came to a violent end. Vikram Singh laughed at the curse, said modern times had no place for superstition. His laugh was bitter. He was wrong. Poirot's smile was thin. Or perhaps someone wished very much for the curse to be remembered. "Come, I have seen enough death for the moment. Now, I require tea. English tea with milk and 2 sugars and a list of every person who was within the palace walls last night. Then, mon colonel, we shall begin to separate the possible from the impossible until only the truth remains." As they turned to leave, a woman appeared in the doorway veiled in white muslin, eyes rimmed with kohl and unshed tears. The Rani Lakshmi Bai. Even in mourning she moved like water-given form, gold anklets chiming softly. She did not speak, only looked at the body of her husband for a long moment, then at Poirot, and something unreadable passed across her face. Grief, perhaps, or calculation. Poirot bowed with exquisite correctness. "Madame, you have my profound sympathy." Her voice was low, musical, edged with steel. "Find who did this, little foreigner. Find them, or the blood of Rajgar will water the desert for a generation." She was gone before Poirot could reply, leaving only the faint scent of jasmine and the echo of her threat hanging in the air like incense. Hastings mopped his brow. "Charming lady, I think I preferred the cobra." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, but the cobra, Hastings, strikes openly. It is the serpent that smiles while it kills that one must truly fear. And in this palace, mon ami, there are serpents wearing the faces of men and of beautiful women. Outside, the sun slipped behind the hills, and the crimson walls turned black against the rising moon. Somewhere a conch shell sounded the call to evening prayer, and the drums of mourning began again, slow and relentless as a heartbeat. Poirot stood listening for a moment, head cocked like a bird, "The play begins," he murmured. "Let us see who among the actors forgets their lines." Chapter 3. The five who coveted the ruby night draped the Sheesh Mahal in 1,000 fractured moons, for every wall was sheeted in tiny mirrors that caught the flames of 100 silver oil lamps and flung them back as restless stars. The air hung heavy with sandalwood and the sweeter, more dangerous perfume of intrigue. Poirot had commanded that the great chandelier remain unlit. He wished faces seen by lamplight, where shadows betray what daylight forgives. At the far end of the hall, upon a dais once reserved for peacocks and dancing girls, 5 chairs had been arranged in a half-circle, like the petals of a poisonous flower. Behind them, upon a black velvet cushion, lay the empty golden setting that had once held the ruby of Cali, its claws now clutching nothing but memory and accusation. Poirot entered without ceremony. A small dark figure in impeccable white, preceded only by the soft gleam of his patent leather shoes upon the marble. Hastings followed, feeling suddenly provincial in his Tussore silk dinner jacket. Colonel Lacy, rigid with military embarrassment, took up station by the door as though guarding against escape. The 5 suspects were already seated, arranged by palace protocol that Poirot had coldly ignored when he dictated the order. Brother, wife, Englishman, soldier, governess, each placed so that no 2 allies might exchange glances without effort. First, nearest the dais, lounged Thakur Amar Singh, younger brother to the dead man, handsome in the reckless way of those born to privilege without responsibility. His mourning turban was tied with careless magnificence. The diamond sarpek at its centre flashed like a wink of complicity. He was drinking whisky from a crystal tumbler he had not been offered, and his eyes, bright with liquor and anticipation, never left the empty ruby setting. Next to him sat Rani Lakshmi Bai, unveiled now, the white of mourning only accentuating the gold of her skin. She wore no jewels save the thin gold wedding ring that had never left her finger. Yet she contrived to look more regal than any woman Hastings had ever seen. Her gaze was fixed upon the cushion as though she could will the ruby back into existence by sheer force of longing. Major Charles Dalrymple, political officer attached to the state, sat stiffly upright, his sunburned face carved from teak. A thin scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, souvenir of some frontier skirmish he never discussed. His hands, gloved despite the heat, rested upon his knees with parade-ground precision. Only the pulse beating at his temple betrayed that he was, after all, flesh. Miss Cynthia Marple, the children's governess, occupied the 4th chair. She was perhaps 30, pale as rice paper, dressed in dove-grey cotton that might have been chosen by a Quaker. Her hands were folded in her lap, the knuckles white. She alone among them looked directly at Poirot, and her eyes were the colour of rain on steel. Last came Colonel Lacy himself, dragged from his intended role of impartial observer to sit among the suspects because Poirot had murmured, almost kindly, that the resident had, after all, been in charge of the ruby during its last journey to the London exhibition, and certain discrepancies in the insurance inventory remained unexplained. Lacy's face had gone the shade of putty, but he had taken the chair without protest. Poirot did not sit. He stood in the centre of the half-circle, small and immaculate, turning slowly so that each felt the weight of his regard. "Mesdames, messieurs," he began, voice soft yet carrying to the furthest mirror, "we are gathered not for a durbar of grief, but for a reckoning. One of you, perhaps more than one, desired 2 things above all others, the death of His late Highness and the possession of the ruby of Cali. Tonight I present the 5 who coveted that stone, and tomorrow, with the help of the good God and my little grey cells, I shall present the one who took it, together with the life of its owner." He let the silence stretch until the lamps themselves seemed to hold their breath. "Commençons. Thakur Amar Singh, you owe the Calcutta moneylenders something in the region of 14 lakhs of rupees. Your brother refused a further loan. With him dead and the ruby vanished, the state treasury falls under your regency until the little prince reaches his majority. A convenient disappearance of the stone would pay many debts, n'est-ce pas?" Amar Singh smiled, a lazy flash of white teeth. "Convenient, certainly. But I was in Ajmer, losing even more money at cards. 50 Englishmen will swear to it." Poirot inclined his head. "We shall verify the quality of their memories." He turned to the Rani. "Madam, you were 22 when an arranged marriage made you the 3rd wife of a man old enough to be your grandfather. Palace gossip says he intended to divorce you for barrenness, an insult no Rajput woman forgives. With him dead, you become regent for your stepson, and the ruby, your personal property, under the marriage settlement, would finance a very comfortable exile in Paris. Lakshmi, Bai lifted her chin. I spent the night in the Zanana. 20 women slept within arm's reach. Touch me with your accusations again, little man, and even your English friends will not save you." Poirot's smile did not waver. "I accuse no one, madame. Yet." To Major Dalrymple he was almost gentle. "Major, you are writing a book, I believe, on the sacred gems of India. A chapter is devoted to the ruby of Kali. You examined the stone in London last year and pronounced it, I quote, beyond price. You also pronounced certain opinions about the backwardness of native rule that reached the ears of the late Maharaja. He threatened to have you transferred to the Andamans." Dalrymple's scar twitched. "I was playing bridge at the Residency until 4 in the morning. The assistant resident and 2 missionaries will testify." "Missionaries," Poirot murmured, "are notoriously truthful. We shall see." Miss Marple received the full force of his attention next. "Mademoiselle, you have been in this palace 7 years, teaching English poetry to children who will never be allowed to read it. You are poor, unmarried, and 30 years old, an age when prospects wither like untended roses. Yet last month you purchased, in the Simla Bazaar, a bottle of Persian attar of roses so rare that only 3 were imported this year. An extravagance, no?" For the first time the governess's composure cracked. A faint flush rose beneath the rice powder pallor. "A gift," she said, so softly that the mirrors themselves seemed to lean closer. "From a friend." "Dead men," Poirot said gently, "give no gifts." Finally, he turned to Colonel Lacy, who had begun to sweat through his tunic. "And you, mon colonel, guardian of the ruby during its travels? Certain discrepancies appear when one compares the weight recorded in London with the weight recorded upon its return. A difference of 0.03 carats, invisible to the naked eye, but suggestive to the expert. Enough, perhaps, to substitute a paste copy long enough to negotiate a private sale." Lacy surged to his feet. "This is outrageous! I have served the Crown for 35 years. Sit down," Poirot said, not loudly, and Lacy sat. "We are all outrageous tonight. Murder makes us so." He stepped back, spreading his hands in a gesture almost theatrical. 5 people, 5 motives, each sufficient for murder, 5 alibis, each apparently perfect. Yet one of you entered a locked and guarded room, drove a dagger upward into a trusting heart, removed a ruby the size of a quail's egg from a living neck, and departed, leaving no trace but a single crimson petal. Tomorrow, mes amis, we begin the sifting. Sleep well, if sleep is possible when conscience is uneasy. He bowed, a small stiff bow from the waist, and turned on his heel. The mirrors caught his departure 1,000 times, a diminutive white figure walking through a galaxy of trembling flames until the great doors closed behind him, and the 5 were left staring at one another across the empty velvet cushion that had once cradled the heart-blood of a goddess. Somewhere in the distance a peacock screamed, a sound so like a woman in mortal terror that Hastings felt his skin creep. Poirot's voice floated back from the corridor, soft as silk, deadly as a kriss. Bonne nuit, mesdames et messieurs. Dream of rubies and of justice. Chapter 4. The Locked Room. Dawn crept over Rajgarh like a guilty thing, pale gold light sliding across the courtyard, where peacocks still slept on the battlements, their tails draped like mourning banners. Poirot was already abroad, immaculate in dove-grey alpaca, a white pith helmet perched upon his head, at an angle that would have caused apoplexy in the Simla Club. He walked alone to the Diwani Khas, refusing even Hastings's company, because, he said, the little grey cells required absolute silence in which to examine the impossible. The sentries had been changed at first light. The new men presented arms with the mixture of awe and suspicion that Poirot attracted wherever he went. He waved them aside with an impatient gesture and entered the chamber of death. The Maharaja had been removed during the night to the cold room beneath the temple, yet the room felt no less crowded. Death has weight. It lingers like incense. The silver throne still bore the dark outline of the body, the blood now dried to a colour disturbingly close to that of the missing ruby. Poirot stood motionless in the centre of the marble floor, turning slowly, absorbing every detail with the concentration of a painter studying an old master for signs of forgery. Then he began his inspection with the meticulous care of a man defusing a bomb. He started with the doors, 2 leaves of solid teak, 4 inches thick, bound with silver straps, and secured by 2 iron bolts as thick as a man's wrist. The bolts slid easily now, oiled by generations of palace servants, but when drawn, they fitted into sockets carved from the living stone of the wall. Poirot examined the sockets through his lens, then the bolts themselves. No scratches, no filing, no trace of forcible withdrawal and reinsertion. He closed the doors, shot the bolts, opened them again. The sound echoed like a prison gate. From the inside, the bolts could be drawn by any hand. From the outside, they were immovable without the strength of 10 men or the subtlety of a magician. Next, the windows, 8 of them, set high in the octagonal walls, each a delicate tracery of iron lattice no wider than a child's fist. Poirot fetched a lacquered Kashmiri ladder from the corridor, placed it beneath the nearest window, and climbed with surprising agility for one who claimed to detest physical exertion. 30 feet below lay the inner courtyard, baked brick upon which no footprint could survive an hour in yesterday's sun. He peered through the lattice. The iron was old but solid, the joints sealed, centuries ago with molten lead. No bar had been cut and replaced, no lattice bent and straightened. He descended, replaced the ladder exactly as he had found it, and stood frowning. The floor came next, white Makrana marble veined with grey, polished to a mirror by bare feet and time. Poirot knelt and passed his hand across it inch by inch. Then lay full length, cheek almost touching the stone, eyes narrowed to slits. Not a scuff, not a smear, not the faintest trace of sand or dust carried in on a human soul. Only that single crimson rose petal, now curled at the edges but still vivid, lying precisely where the Maharaja's right hand would have rested Had it fallen from his grasp? Poirot lifted it delicately between kid-gloved fingers and sniffed. Damask rose, heavy, cloying, the perfume of Persian gardens rather than Rajput. He slipped it into a small envelope and sealed it with a wafer. The throne itself was a masterpiece of Rajasthani silverwork, vines and lotuses and elephants twined about a high back studded with turquoises. The seat cushion, cloth of gold now stiff with blood, had been slit open by the police surgeon in search of the ruby. Nothing. Poirot ran his fingers along every join, every crevice. He tapped the armrests solid. He examined the back solid. He even lay on the floor again, and peered beneath nothing but dust and the faint glitter of a lost sequin from some long-forgotten Nautch girl's costume. He rose at last and stood before the body's outline, hands clasped behind his back, rocking gently on the balls of his feet. The dagger had entered beneath the fifth rib, angled sharply upward into the heart. A woman's blow, perhaps, or a man striking from below. The Maharaja had been seated when he died. The blood pattern proved it. He had not struggled. There were no defensive wounds. He had admitted his killer, turned perhaps to speak, and received death as a trusted gift. Poirot closed his eyes and reconstructed the moment. The soft footfall on marble, the rustle of silk, the sudden glint of steel, the gasp that never became a cry. He opened his eyes again and addressed the empty room in a whisper. Someone you loved, mon prince, or someone you did not fear. Someone who knew exactly where the ruby lay against your skin, and how to unclasp the chain one-handed in the dark. Someone who then walked out of this room, shot the bolts behind them, and left no trace but a single petal that should not exist. He spent another hour searching for the unfindable. Secret doors disguised as mirror frames, hollow pillars, a loose slab in the floor. He found nothing. The room was precisely what it claimed to be, an octagonal stone box, sealed tighter than a pharaoh's tomb. At length he stepped back into the sunlight, removed the pith helmet, and mopped his forehead with a handkerchief the size of a small tablecloth. Hastings was waiting on the terrace with a tray of tea that had long since grown cold. "Well?" he demanded. "Anything?" Poirot accepted a cup without seeming to notice its temperature. "Everything, mon ami, and nothing. The room is impossible. Therefore the impossibility must lie elsewhere in the petal, perhaps, or in the perfume that still lingers like a ghost, or in the nature of the wound itself. Come, we will now examine the roof." The roof was reached by a narrow staircase, concealed behind a jaili screen in the zenana corridor. It opened onto a terrace where palace women once took the air unseen by male eyes. Now it was deserted, save for pigeons and the heat. From here the latticed windows of the Diwani cars were visible 30 feet below, small ornamental grilles no larger than a man's head. A low parapet surrounded the terrace. Beyond it, the palace wall dropped sheer to the rocks 500 feet above the desert. Poirot walked to the edge and looked down. Vultures rode the thermals with insolent grace. "Observe," he said, pointing. "From this height, a silk rope might be lowered to the window lattice, a climber descend, enter, commit the crime, and ascend again. The rope withdrawn, no trace upon the dusty courtyard below. Simple." Hastings stared. "But the lattice is solid iron. You couldn't open it from outside." "Exactly," Poirot said with satisfaction. "Therefore no one did. Yet someone was in that room. Ergo, the answer lies not in how they left, but in how they were already there." He turned away from the view and began pacing the terrace, eyes fixed upon the terracotta tiles. After 20 minutes, he stopped and pointed to a patch near the parapet, where the tiles were fractionally cleaner than their neighbours, as though something had recently rested there. A basket, perhaps, he murmured, or a coil of rope, or a woman's silk sari used as a ladder and then drawn up after her. Silk is strong, Hastings, and a determined woman is stronger still. He knelt, produced his lens again, and began examining the parapet's coping stone. After a moment he gave a small exclamation of triumph and held up a single thread caught on a roughness crimson silk, so fine it was almost invisible. "From a sari border," he said softly. "The colour worn only by royal women in this palace. Curious, no?" Far below, the morning drums began again, slow and relentless. Poirot stood listening. The crimson thread held between thumb and forefinger like a drop of fresh blood. "The room is locked," he said at last. "The windows barred, the roof empty, yet murder was done, and a ruby the size of a man's heart was stolen. Somewhere, mon ami, a woman is missing one thread from her sari, and another carries the scent of damask roses upon her skin. When we find them, we find our killer." He tucked the thread into another envelope, sealed it, and slipped it into his pocket with the petal. "Come," he said briskly, "it is time for breakfast. Even the little grey cells require croissants when they are working hard." Chapter 5. The Curse of the Bloodstone. The palace temple crouched beneath the northwest bastion, like a jewelled toad, its domes green with verdigris, its walls alive with carvings of gods and demons, locked in eternal, explicit embrace. Poirot entered at noon, when the sun stood directly overhead, and the courtyard became a furnace in which even the pigeons sought shade. He had removed his hat out of respect, though he mistrusted all temples on principle. They smelled, he said, of too many centuries of incense and fear. Hastings trailed behind, already wilting in the heat, while Colonel Lacy had pleaded urgent paperwork and remained behind. The great doors of carved sandalwood stood open. Inside, a single oil lamp burned before the image of Kali, black, terrible, garlanded with fresh marigolds, and Poirot noted with a shiver a necklace of real human skulls, no larger than walnuts. An ancient priest awaited them, skeletal, ash-smeared, eyes milky with cataract yet somehow still seeing. He sat cross-legged upon a tiger skin, a brass tray of offerings before him. Rice, vermilion, a small silver bowl filled with what looked disturbingly like blood. When Poirot approached, the old man raised a hand knotted with arthritis, and began to speak in a voice like dry leaves scraping stone. "The Belgi Sahib wishes to hear the curse," he said in courtly Hindustani. "All foreigners wish to hear it before they die." Poirot bowed with perfect correctness. "I wish to hear it, Babaji, because I do not intend to die. Knowledge is the enemy of fear." The priest rocked gently, the skulls on Kali's necklace clicking like ivory dice. 400 years ago, he began, in the reign of Rao Jaimal, a Nautch girl from Persia danced before the Rao, wearing the ruby of Kali, torn from the goddess's own forehead during the sack of Chittor. The Rao desired her above all women. She desired only the ruby. One night she cut his throat while he slept, took the stone, and fled toward the desert. The priests overtook her at the gates. They bound her living to this very pillar, and flayed her slowly, chanting that whoever next stole the blood of Kali would die by the hand they trusted most, in a room without doors, and the stone would drink their heart's blood before it vanished forever. Since that night, every ruler who wore the ruby openly has met violent death. The last was Maharaja Vikram Singh. He fell silent, the lamp flame guttered, though there was no wind. Poirot regarded the image of Kali tongue, lolling, eyes mad with divine hunger, and felt the small hairs rise along his neck despite himself. "And yet," he said softly, "someone was willing to risk the goddess's wrath for a stone." The priest smiled, a terrible stretching of parchment skin over bone. "The goddess does not strike. She merely opens the door for human greed. The curse is convenient, sahib. It terrifies servants. It empties corridors. It makes men look at shadows, instead of at the hand that holds the knife." Poirot inclined his head. "You are a philosopher, Babaji." "I am a man who has watched many men die for a red stone," the priest replied. "The ruby drinks more than light." That evening Poirot summoned Hastings to the small antechamber that had been given them as an office. A punkah creaked overhead, stirred by an invisible coolie. The air smelled of hot brass and despair. Poirot sat at a table littered with lists, telegrams, and a large-scale plan of the palace spread beneath a green-shaded lamp. "Listen, Hastings," he said without looking up. "The curse is nonsense, yet it is also everything. Someone has used it the way a conjurer uses smoke to hide the movement of the hand. While the palace trembles at ghosts, a very living murderer walks unseen." He pushed across a sheet of palace notepaper, covered in his neat continental handwriting. "Consider the facts again. The Maharaja was not simply killed, he was arranged. The body upright on the throne, the dagger driven with ceremonial precision, the ruby removed with the delicacy of a lover unclasping a necklace. This is not murder for gain alone. It is murder as theatre. Someone wished the curse to be remembered, perhaps even believed." Hastings mopped his face. "Do you think the killer staged the whole thing to look supernatural?" "I think," Poirot said precisely, "that someone understood the power of superstition over the Indian mind. A locked room, a vanished jewel, a single crimson petal. These are not clues, mon ami. They are signatures." He rose and began pacing, 4 steps one way, 4 steps back, hands clasped behind him. "Now attend. This afternoon I walked through the palace gardens. The white roses are indeed the only variety grown within the walls, an old tradition, symbol of purity. Yet our petal is damask deep red, the flower of Persian love poetry. Someone brought it from outside, or someone grows forbidden roses in secret. Both possibilities are suggestive." A sudden clamour of women's voices erupted from the Zenana corridor, rising to a shrill crescendo of terror. Hastings reached automatically for his service revolver, but Poirot was already moving. They arrived in the marble gallery to find a knot of sari-clad women clustered around something on the floor. The Rani Lakshmi Bai stood apart, arms folded, face unreadable. On the checkered marble lay a small wicker basket covered by a silk cloth. From beneath the cloth protruded the glossy black wedge of a cobra's head, hood half spread, tongue flickering like a red thread. One of the younger women was sobbing. "It was in Miss Marple's room, delivered with the evening milk." Poirot knelt, lifted the cloth with his cane. The cobra regarded him with flat obsidian eyes, then struck with blinding speed. Poirot did not flinch. The cane flicked, pinning the snake just behind the hood. The basket rocked, revealing a second cobra coiled inside. "2 for the price of 1, Poirot murmured. "How extravagant!" Miss Cynthia Marple appeared in the doorway of her room, pale but composed, a brass lota still in her hand. "I heard the basket fall," she said quietly. "When I looked, the lid was off. The first snake was already out. I killed it with this." She indicated the lota. Its base was dark with blood and venom. Hastings stared. "Good God, woman, you might have been killed." Miss Marple's smile was thin. I have lived in India 7 years, Captain Hastings, one learns. Poirot released the pinned cobra into the basket, slammed the lid, and handed it to a trembling servant with orders to burn both snakes in the courtyard. Then he turned to the governess, eyes very bright. "Mademoiselle, you are either very brave or very fortunate. Cobras do not deliver themselves with the evening milk. Someone placed that basket in your room while you were absent at dinner. Someone who knew you would not scream." Miss Marple met his gaze steadily. "Someone who wished me dead, you mean? Or someone who wished us to believe they wished you dead," Poirot corrected gently. "Tell me, did you notice anything unusual about the basket? A scent, perhaps?" For the first time the woman hesitated. "Roses," she said at last. "Damask roses, strong enough to cover the musk of the snake." Poirot's smile was almost tender. "Exactement. The signature again." He bowed and withdrew, leaving the women to their hysteria. In the corridor, he paused, sniffing the air like a fastidious cat. "The scent lingers, Hastings. Persian roses and reptile death. Our murderer grows bold, or perhaps desperate." High above them the temple bell tolled once, a deep brazen note that seemed to vibrate in the bones. Poirot looked up toward the sound, eyes glittering. "Kali is patient," he murmured, "but Hercule Poirot is not. The net tightens, mon ami. Very soon now the little fish will feel the mesh." Chapter 6. A Game of Shadows and Snakes. The interviews took place in a small chamber that had once been a Zenana music room, its walls still painted with faded miniatures of Krishna and the gopis, its latticed windows overlooking a courtyard where parakeets screamed like unhinged children. Poirot had chosen it deliberately. The light through the lattice fell in bars of gold and shadow, making every face a half-mask. He sat behind a low ebony table on which lay only a silver tray with a single glass of water and the crimson silk thread he had found on the roof. One by one they came, summoned by a palace servant who spoke no French, and therefore could not be bribed or threatened into warning them. Thakur Amar Singh arrived first, reeking of whisky and French perfume, his eyes bloodshot but defiant. He flung himself into the rosewood chair opposite Poirot, and smiled the lazy, dangerous smile of a man who has never been refused anything for long. "You may ask your questions, little detective," he said in English public school accents, "but I have already told you. I was in Ajmer, losing money I did not possess. 50 witnesses, including the assistant commissioner. Even your Scotland Yard could not break that alibi." Poirot regarded him with the mild interest of a connoisseur examining a flawed emerald. "Alibis, mon prince, are like Rajput honour, magnificent until one looks closely. Tell me, did you happen to visit the Ajmer Bazaar during your stay? There is a shop that sells Persian attar of roses. Only 3 bottles came to India this year. One was purchased by a European lady in Simla. One sits upon your dressing table. The third is missing." Amar Singh's smile faltered for the first time. "Coincidence," he said, but his voice had lost its languor. "Coincidence," Poirot repeated softly, "is the refuge of the guilty. You lent your bottle to someone, perhaps? A woman who wished to leave her signature upon murder. We shall test the dregs when the police laboratory in Delhi is finished with them." The Thakur rose abruptly. "This interview is over." "On the contrary," Poirot said, "it has only begun, but you may go, for now." Next came Rani Lakshmi Bai, moving with the deliberate grace of a tigress who knows the bars of her cage are gilded, but bars nonetheless. She wore mourning white again, but a single ruby glowed in her nostril like a drop of fresh blood. She did not sit until Poirot rose and inclined his head. Then she sank into the chair as though bestowing a favour. "You waste your time, little man," she said in a voice like temple bells heard across water. "I was in the zenana. 20 women, 30 perhaps, slept within arm's reach. My lord came to me at sunset. We spoke of state matters. He left at moonrise. After that, I did not stir until the screaming began at dawn." Poirot studied her for a long moment. "Yet someone borrowed your perfume, madame. The scent that lingered in the locked room was yours alone. Attar of roses from the gardens of Shiraz. And someone wore a crimson sari the night of the murder. The thread I hold matches exactly the border of the sari you wore to the Durbar last month. Curious, no?" The Rani's eyes narrowed to slits of jet. "Many women have crimson saris. Many have rose oil. You will need more than threads and scents to accuse a queen." Poirot smiled. "I have more, madame. Much more. But I am patient." Major Dalrymple marched in like a man on parade, gloved hands clasped behind his back, scar livid in the striped light. "I have nothing to hide," he announced before Poirot could speak. "Bridge at the residency until 4, then bed, the assistant resident, his wife, and 2 missionaries. You may wire for confirmation." Poirot waved a small hand. "Already done, Major. The reply came this morning. You were indeed seen to leave the card table at 4:12 precisely. What the telegram did not say was that you returned to the palace by the old Watergate at 4:40, using a key you had copied 6 months ago when the ruby was exhibited in London. The gatekeeper is an old soldier. He remembers the scar." Dalrymple went very still. "That is a lie. The gatekeeper is prepared to swear to it before a magistrate. He also remembers that you carried a small basket covered in silk. The same silk, perhaps, that lined the basket delivered to Miss Marple last night." The Major's jaw worked soundlessly for a moment. "You have no proof." "I have the gatekeeper," Poirot said gently, "and I have the thread, and I have the scent. It is enough to begin." Colonel Lacy came last of the morning, blustering and crimson, smelling faintly of whisky and fear. "This is damned impertinence, Poirot. I've cabled Delhi. You'll be on the next train to Bombay if you persist in this nonsense." Poirot waited until the colonel had run out of breath. "Mon colonel, you were responsible for the ruby's safe transport to London and back. The insurance weight differs by 0.03 carats. A trivial amount, yet enough for a clever man to substitute paste and sell the real stone to a private collector. When the Maharaja discovered the discrepancy, he threatened exposure. Murder became convenient." Lacy's face turned the colour of old chalk. "You cannot prove—" "I do not need to prove," Poirot interrupted. "I need only to ask why the duplicate key to the Diwani Khas lattice, reported missing last year, was found this morning in your desk drawer wrapped in a handkerchief that smells, very faintly, of damask roses." The colonel sat down heavily. "In the afternoon, Miss Cynthia Marple came unescorted, walking with the quiet precision of a woman who has long ago learned that noise attracts the wrong kind of attention. She wore the same dove-grey cotton, the same calm expression, but her eyes were brighter, almost feverish. 'You wish to see me again, Monsieur Poirot?' 'Mademoiselle, you received a gift of perfume in Simla. From whom?' She hesitated only a fraction. 'From the Maharaja. He was kind.' 'Kind,' Poirot repeated. 'Yet he sent cobras to your room. Strange kindness.' Miss Marple's hands twisted in her lap. 'I do not believe he sent the snakes.' 'No? Then who placed the basket while you dined? Who knew you would not scream, would kill the first cobra with a water jug as calmly as one might swat a mosquito? Only someone who knew you very well indeed.' For the first time the mask slipped. Something ancient and cold looked out of her eyes. "You understand nothing," she whispered. "On the contrary," Poirot said softly, "I understand everything except the final piece. You are not English, mademoiselle. Your papers say you were born in Darjeeling, but your accent when you are startled is Persian. Your mother danced in Tehran before she came to India as the Maharaja's mistress. You are his daughter, are you not? The child he acknowledged in secret but never in public. The ruby was promised to you, then denied when a legitimate heir was born. That is why you killed him." Miss Marple rose in one fluid movement. "You have no proof." "I have the thread," Poirot said, "and the scent, and the cobras that were meant to silence you before you could speak. But you will not be silenced, will you? Not now." She stood very still, then smiled a small, terrible smile. "Find your proof, little Belgian. Until then, the shadows are mine." She was gone, leaving only the faint sweetness of damask roses, and the echo of her footsteps dying along the painted corridor, like the last notes of a requiem. Poirot sat motionless for a long time. The crimson thread twisted around his finger like a ring of blood. Outside, the sun began its slow descent toward the desert. And somewhere in the palace, a woman began to laugh softly, triumphantly, the sound of a snake-tasting air. Chapter 7. The Alibi of the Monsoon. The storm arrived without warning, as monsoon storms in Rajasthan always do, a wall of bruised cloud that swallowed the sun whole and turned noon into bruised twilight. One moment, the courtyard baked under brazen light. The next, the sky split open, and rain fell in solid sheets, drumming on the red sandstone until the palace seemed to bleed. Thunder rolled across the desert like artillery. Lightning clawed the battlements and lit the Sheesh Mahal in strobing white. Poirot had waited for this storm, the way a chess master waits for the inevitable blunder. He stood now at the centre of the mirrored hall, small and immaculate beneath the great unlit chandelier, while water streamed from every arch. And the punkahs hung motionless, their pullers fled to shelter. He had summoned them all, every suspect, every witness, every servant who had been within the palace walls that night. They came dripping and sullen, the Rani veiled in sodden white, Thakur Amar Singh already half-drunk, Major Dalrymple rigid with fury, Colonel Lacey twitching like a man with fever, Miss Cynthia Marple pale as candle wax but dry, somehow untouched by the rain, as though the storm itself hesitated to mark her. Behind them crowded the palace women, the guards, the major domo, even the ancient priest who had spoken of curses, all pressed shoulder to shoulder beneath the restless mirrors that flung their frightened faces back 1,000-fold. Poirot raised one small hand, and the hall fell silent except for the roar of water. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, voice clear as cut glass above the storm, "tonight the heavens themselves conspire to wash away lies. Tonight we end the comedy of perfect alibis." He moved to a table on which lay the objects he had gathered like a magician displaying his props. The crimson silk thread sealed in glass, the dried rose petal, the tiny phial of attar of roses now half empty, the duplicate lattice key still wrapped in laces, handkerchief, the gatekeeper's deposition, the laboratory report from Delhi, and most damning of all, a single brass cobra-headed bracelet that had not been there an hour earlier. "Observe," he said, holding the bracelet high so that the mirrors caught its gleam and flung it into every corner. This belonged to the late Maharaja. It was found this afternoon inside the hollow leg of the silver throne, a hiding place no one thought to search, because the throne was solid silver. None, except that one leg, very cleverly, unscrews. Inside were also traces of the same attar used to mask the scent of venom when the cobras were transported. Someone placed it there today, thinking to incriminate another. Someone who forgot that Hercule Poirot never forgets. Colonel Lacy made a strangled sound. Poirot turned to him almost kindly. "Mon Colonel, you have been very stupid. You allowed yourself to be used as a cat's paw. The discrepancy in the ruby's weight. Arranged so that suspicion would fall on you, the Englishman who could be sacrificed without offending Rajput pride. The key in your drawer, planted, the handkerchief, stolen from your laundry. You were meant to hang, monsieur, so that the real murderer might walk free." Lacy opened his mouth, closed it, sat down heavily. Poirot's gaze swept the hall. "Now we come to the alibis, those beautiful, unbreakable alibis. Thakur Amar Singh in Ajmer, 50 witnesses. Major Dalrymple playing bridge until dawn. The Rani surrounded by 30 women. Colonel Lacy asleep in the residency. Miss Marple alone in her room. Perfect, 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 yet all of them lies." He let the silence stretch until the thunder filled it. "Listen," he commanded, and as if the storm obeyed him, the rain redoubled, lashing the lattice until water poured through in silver ropes. This is the sound that covered every footstep that night. This same monsoon deluge that began at 2 in the morning and continued until dawn. The guards huddled in their turbans deafened. The courtyard turned to a lake, washing away every trace of rope or ladder. The perfect night for murder. He began to walk among them, a small black figure among the wet and frightened crowd. Thakur Amar Singh was not in Ajmer. He returned by motor car at midnight, soaked to the skin, paid the driver triple to keep silent, and was admitted by the old water gate. Major Dalrymple did not play bridge until 4. He left at 1:30, returned briefly at 4:40 to establish his alibi, then left again. The missionaries were too deep in their theological brandy to notice the exact hour. The Rani was not in the zenana after moonrise. She walked the roof terrace in crimson silk, lowering a rope of saris knotted together, strong enough for a slight woman to descend and ascend. 30 women swore she never left, because 30 women feared her wrath more than they feared perjury. He stopped before Miss Marple. "And you, mademoiselle, were never alone. You were seen by the old ayah who brought hot milk at 3, seen descending from the roof with wet hair and a darker stain upon your grey cotton dress that might have been blood. You killed the cobras meant to silence you, because you knew who sent them and why. You kept one bracelet as insurance." Miss Marple did not move, but something shifted behind her eyes, an ancient calculation. Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to the furthest mirror. "You are the Maharaja's daughter by the Persian dancer, acknowledged in secret, denied in public when a legitimate son was born. The ruby was your inheritance, promised and then withdrawn. You planned everything. The locked room to invoke the curse, the vanished jewel, the cobras to terrify witnesses, the false clues to incriminate others. You had accomplices amassing for money, Dalrymple for ambition, the Rani for hatred, Lacy as scapegoat. Each believed they acted for their own gain. None understood they were puppets." He held up the phial of attar. "This scent was your signature, the perfume your mother wore when she danced for the Maharaja 40 years ago. You used it to remember and to remind him, in his final moment, who held the knife." The storm reached its climax. Lightning struck the flagstaff with a sound like the crack of doom. and for one blinding instant, every mirror showed the same image. Miss Cynthia Marple standing very straight, rainwater streaming from her hair like tears. The brass cobra bracelet glinting on her wrist where it had always been, hidden beneath her sleeve. She smiled then, a small, sad smile. "Prove it," she said, exactly as she had in the music room. Poirot reached into his pocket and produced the ruby of Kali itself, wrapped in a crimson petal, now faded almost black. "I already have," he said gently. "It was hidden inside the second cobra's basket, sewn into the lining. The snake that was meant to kill you carried your birthright instead. You could not bear to destroy it, even to save yourself." The hall was silent, except for the rain. Miss Marple looked at the ruby, at the bracelet, at the faces turned toward her in horror and fascination, and for the first time the mask cracked completely. "He promised me," she whispered. "In my mother's blood he promised." Then the storm moved on, as suddenly as it had come, leaving only the drip of water from the lattices and the smell of wet stone. Poirot replaced the ruby in its velvet bag and handed it to Colonel Lacey. "The case is closed," he said simply. "The monsoon has washed everything clean." Outside, the first stars appeared, cold and indifferent above the Crimson Palace. Chapter 8. The Scent of Roses. The storm had passed, but the Sheesh Mahal still dripped like a cavern of glass, every mirror weeping slow tears onto the marble. Oil lamps had been relit. Their flames trembled in the wet air and turned the 1,000 reflections into a restless golden sea. Poirot had ordered the great doors barred and the sentries doubled. No one would leave until the play reached its final line. The suspects stood in the same half-circle as before, yet everything had changed. The empty velvet cushion now held the ruby of Kali, returned to its golden claws, its black star drinking the lamplight and giving nothing back. Miss Cynthia Marple no longer Miss. No longer Cynthia stood directly beneath the unlit chandelier, hands clasped before her in the attitude of a penitent. The brass cobra bracelet gleaming on her left wrist like a shackle she had chosen herself. Poirot began to speak softly, almost conversationally, as though remarking upon the weather. In every great crime there is a moment of pure vanity, when the murderer must sign the canvas. For some it is a taunt left upon the body, for others a jewel worn openly at the throat of the hangman. For you, Soraya Begum, once Cynthia Marple, once the nameless daughter of a dancing girl, the signature was sent. Attar of roses from the gardens of Shiraz, the same perfume your mother wore when she first enchanted a prince and was destroyed for it. You bathed the murder in that scent. The petal on the floor, the dagger's hilt, the lining of the cobra basket, even the hollow throne leg where you hid the bracelet that would damn your accomplices. You wanted him to know, in his final breath, exactly whose hand held the knife. Soraya did not deny it. She lifted her head, and for the first time the lamps caught the full beauty of her face, no longer pale English rose, but something older, fiercer, carved from ivory and fire. "He sat upon that throne," she said, voice low, yet carrying to the furthest mirror, "and told me the ruby would go to his legitimate son, the son of a Rajput woman who despised me. He said I was a scandal to be paid off and forgotten. I was 17 when he first promised me the stone. I was 30 when he broke the promise. 13 years of waiting in corridors, teaching children who would never call me sister, smiling while my blood was denied. Yes, I wanted him to smell his past when he died." Colonel Lacey made a choking sound. Major Dalrymple stared at the floor. Thakur Amar Singh laughed once short, incredulous, then stopped as though someone had struck him. The Rani alone remained unmoved, a statue in white marble. Poirot continued, inexorable. You planned for years. You cultivated each accomplice like a separate poison garden. To Amar Singh, you promised cancellation of his debts, and a regency ripe for looting. To Major Dalrymple, you offered the ruby itself, once the curse had frightened away all other buyers. To Colonel Lacy, you whispered of scandals that would end his career unless he looked the other way. To the Rani, you offered freedom from a husband who had begun to speak of divorce and disgrace. Each believed they pulled the strings. None understood they danced on yours. He stepped closer, close enough to catch the ghost of that fatal perfume still clinging to her hair. The mechanics were exquisite. On the night of the murder, the monsoon arrived early your luck, or perhaps your calculation. You walked the roof terrace in a crimson sari, borrowed from the Rani's wardrobe, knotted 6 silk saris end to end strong enough for your weight, lowered yourself to the lattice window which Major Dalrymple had quietly unfastened weeks earlier, under pretext of measuring for new screens. You entered. The Maharaja greeted you with pleasure. He always greeted you with pleasure, did he not? You were the secret daughter who asked nothing, who brought him English newspapers and quiet conversation. He turned to place a paper on the table. You struck once, upward beneath the ribs, exactly as your mother's people strike when honor demands blood. Then you unclasped the ruby you knew the secret catch better than he did, pressed the crimson petal into his dying hand so that it would fall as signature, and climbed back to the roof. The rain erased every trace. The bolted doors were never unbolted. You never needed them. Soraya's eyes never left his. And the cobras? She asked almost curiously. A refinement. You intended them for yourself once the ruby was safe. A dramatic suicide that would close every mouth. But when suspicion began to settle on others, you kept the snakes alive. Used them to terrify, to warn, to watch me circle closer. Only when I found the hollow throne leg did you realize the game was ending. You placed the bracelet there this afternoon, hoping to buy silence with one final betrayal. He reached out and touched the brass cobra on her wrist, gently, as one might touch a loaded pistol. Your mother wore one like this when she danced for him the first time. You wore it when you killed him the last. For a long moment, the only sound was the slow drip of water from the mirrors. Then Soraya Begum did something no one expected. She laughed soft, musical, the laugh of a woman who has finally laid down an unbearable weight. "Little Belgian," she said, "you are magnificent. My mother would have liked you." She always said a man who understood perfume understood everything. She reached up, unclasped the ruby from its setting with the ease of long familiarity, and held it to the lamplight. The black star flashed once, like an eye-opening. "It is beautiful, is it not?" she whispered. "All that blood for this small piece of corundum. My mother died in a charity hospital in Bombay, while he bought another wife with emeralds. I swore the stone would acknowledge me or destroy me. It has done both." She pressed the ruby into Poirot's hand. "Keep it safe, little man. Cayley has drunk enough for one lifetime." Then, before anyone could move, she turned to the nearest lamp, lifted the glass chimney, and plunged her right hand into the flame. The scent of burning flesh mingled instantly with the sweeter, indelible perfume of roses. She did not scream. She only smiled as the brass bracelet glowed red and the skin blackened around it. Guards rushed forward, beating out the flames with their turbans, but the damage was done. Soraya sank to her knees, cradling the charred hand against her breast. tears cutting clean channels through the soot on her cheeks. The Rani stepped forward at last, voice cold as desert night. "Take her to the Zenana physician. Bind her wounds. She will live to stand trial. Rajgarh will not be cheated of its justice." Poirot stood very still, the ruby of Kali heavy in his palm, the scent of burnt roses and scorched flesh thick in his throat. For the first time in many years, he felt something close to pity. "She has already stood trial," he said quietly, "and the sentence was pronounced 40 years ago, in a palace very like this one, by a man who forgot that promises made in blood must be kept in blood." He closed his fingers over the stone until the edges cut his skin. "The play is over," he murmured. "Let the curtain fall." Chapter 9. The Little Grey Cells. Assemble. The Durbar Hall had been cleared of all but the essential players, the great doors barred, the mirrors veiled in black muslin so that no restless reflections might distract the mind. Dawn was still 2 hours away. The only light came from a single argand lamp on the marble table, and the occasional flicker of lightning that lingered on the horizon like a reluctant ghost. Poirot sat alone at the centre, the ruby of Kali before him on its scrap of faded velvet, the charred cobra bracelet beside it, and around these two objects the neat array of evidence he had gathered over 9 days. The crimson thread, the dried petal, the phial of attar, the laboratory report, the Watergate deposition, the hollow throne leg unscrewed and laid open like a confession. He looked, Hastings thought, like a jeweller who has finally arranged every stone in the necklace, and now waits only for the clasp to snap shut. Colonel Lacy, Major Dalrymple, Thakur Amar Singh, the Rani Lakshmi Bai, and Soraya Begum bandaged now, the right hand wrapped in gauze already spotted with fresh blood, were brought in under guard and seated in a half-circle. No one spoke. The air smelled of wet stone, lamp oil, and the faint, ineradicable sweetness of damask roses that seemed to have soaked into the very walls. Poirot did not rise. He merely lifted his gaze and began quietly, without drama, the way a surgeon begins the final incision. Order, method, and the little grey cells. These are all I ever asked of a problem, and in return this problem has given me everything. Let us, for the last time, assemble the pieces. First, the locked room. Impossible only if one insists that the murderer entered and left by a door or a window that never opened. But the roof terrace is part of the palace, unguarded on a night of monsoon, and 6 silk saris knotted together make a rope strong enough for a slight woman of determination. Major Dalrymple loosened the lattice screws weeks earlier. The marks were there for anyone who looked closely enough. The rain erased every footprint, every trace of descent and ascent. Simple. Second, the dagger thrust upward beneath the ribs. A woman's blow, or a man striking from a lower position. The Maharaja sat upon his throne. The killer stood before him, close, trusted. He had no time to rise, no time even to cry out. He knew his murderer intimately. Third, the vanished ruby. Not vanished at all. Removed by the one person who had worn it in secret since childhood, who knew the hidden catch at the back of the setting, who could unclasp it with one hand while the other held the dagger steady. The stone was carried out the same way it came in against the murderer's heart, beneath a grey cotton bodice that looked modest and hid everything. Fourth, the crimson petal. Not a clue, but a signature. Damask roses do not grow in Rajgarh. They grow only in one small locked hothouse behind the Zenana, tended by a woman who was once a Persian dancing girl's daughter. The petal was carried in from the beginning, pressed between the pages of a book of Keats that sat always on the murderer's table. Fifth, the scent. Attar of roses, Persian, rare, unmistakable. Purchased in Simla by Miss Cynthia Marple, with money sent secretly by the Maharaja, who believed he was buying affection. Used later to anoint the dagger, the petal, the lining of the cobra basket, the hollow throne leg. A thread of memory binding every part of the crime to the past. Sixth, the cobras. Intended first as a suicide dramatic final, in keeping with the curse. When suspicion shifted, they became weapons to silence witnesses, then hiding places for the ruby itself, sewn into the basket lining until the moment was safe. The snakes were milked of venom first. The murderer is cruel, but not suicidal. Seventh, the accomplices, each given just enough truth to believe they controlled the game. Amar Singh was promised debt forgiveness and a regency. Dalrymple was promised the ruby for his secret collection. Lacey was threatened with exposure over the weight discrepancy he never noticed. The Rani was promised freedom. None understood that their strings were tied to the same hand. And last, the curse, the most brilliant stroke of all. By arranging the murder to echo the ancient prophecy death, by a trusted hand, in a room without entrance, the killer turned superstition into an army. Servants looked for ghosts and saw nothing human. Guards trembled at shadows and forgot to watch the roof. The British resident himself spoke of Kali's anger before he spoke of footprints. A curse is only words until someone gives it flesh. Poirot lifted the ruby, let it catch the lamplight, let the black star blaze once like a drop of night. All of this required one mind patient, cold, wounded beyond healing. A mind that watched for 13 years while a promise made to a dying dancer was broken again and again. A mind that studied every corridor, every latch, every weakness of every player. A mind that understood perfume better than fear, and fear better than truth. He turned at last to Soraya Begum. The gauze around her burned hand was now dark crimson, but her eyes were steady, almost peaceful. "You planned for every contingency except one," he said gently. "You did not plan that Hercule Poirot would care more for the pattern than for the curse. You left the pattern perfect, and perfection is always visible to the little grey cells." Soraya looked at him for a long moment, then inclined her head, a small, regal gesture that belonged to no English governess. "I underestimated the little Belgian," she said, and her voice was soft, almost amused. "My mother warned me that one day a man would come who saw clearly. She said he would be small, fastidious, and dangerous. She was right." She rose without permission, ignoring the guards, and walked to the table. With her unbound left hand, she lifted the ruby, weighed it once, then placed it carefully in Poirot's palm and closed his fingers over it. "Give it to the boy," she said. "Let him wear it openly and die of something ordinary pneumonia, perhaps, or a hunting accident. Let the curse end with me." She turned to the Rani. "And you, madam, may keep your regency. Rule well. Be kinder than he was." To Amar Singh, to Dalrymple, to Lacey, she offered no farewell. They were already shrinking into the small, shabby men they had always been beneath their titles and uniforms. Finally, she looked at Poirot again. "Will you watch me hang?" she asked. Poirot's face was unreadable. "I do not attend executions," he said. "They are untidy." Soraya smiled the same small, sad smile she had worn when she burned her hand. "Then remember me when you smell roses," she whispered, and walked between the guards toward the door, straight-backed, barefoot on the cold marble, leaving faint crimson prints that looked, in the lamplight, exactly like scattered petals. The lamp flickered once and steadied. Outside, the first pale wash of dawn touched the battlements. turning the crimson walls the colour of old, forgiven blood. Poirot sat alone with the ruby in his closed fist, listening to the sound of chains and the last fading scent of damask roses carried away on the morning wind. Chapter 10. The Murderer Unmasked. The sun rose at last over Rajgarh, a thin blade of fire sliding between the hills and striking the palace walls until the sandstone blazed like a furnace. In the great courtyard, the military police stood in scarlet ranks, bayonets fixed, while above them on the Jarokha balcony, the little prince, 7 years old, draped in white mourning, waited to receive the Ruby of Kali, and the news that his father's killer had been taken. Below, in the Sheesh Mahal, now stripped of its black hangings, the mirrors unveiled again and mercilessly, multiplying every face, Poirot prepared to speak the final words. Soraya Begum stood between two sepoys, the bandage on her right hand dark and stiff with blood, yet she held herself as though the chains were merely another ornament. The Rani, Colonel Lacy, Major Dalrymple, Thakur Amar Singh, and a silent crowd of courtiers formed a half-circle that parted like water when Poirot entered. He did not mount the dais. He remained on the marble floor, small, immaculate, the ruby in its golden setting resting on a black velvet cushion held by Hastings, who still looked faintly stunned by the speed with which order had been torn apart and stitched together again. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, voice carrying without effort to the furthest arch, "the play is finished. The murderer stands before you, unmasked not by chains or by confession, but by the inevitability of truth. Soraya Begum, daughter of the Maharaja Vikram Singh, by the Persian dancer Noor Jahan, known to the British as Miss Cynthia Marple, planned and executed the perfect crime. And then, because perfection is intolerable to the human soul, she signed it with roses." He lifted the ruby so that the morning light struck through it, turning the black star into a living pulse. "This stone has drunk the blood of many men, but none so bitterly as the man who promised it to a child and then denied her existence. The motive was not greed. Greed is simple. The motive was justice terrible, ancient, Rajput justice that demands an eye for an eye and a heart for a broken heart." Soraya spoke for the first time, her voice clear, almost light. "Say rather vengeance, little detective. Justice would have been satisfied with the ruby. I took his life because he took my mother's." A murmur rippled through the hall, but Poirot raised one small hand, and it died. "The method you already know. The knotted saris, the loosened lattice, the upward thrust of the katar, the petal, the scent. What you do not know is how nearly the curtain fell on tragedy rather than triumph. Twice she prepared her own death, the cobra's, the flame because she believed the curse required it. Twice she drew back because the daughter of Noor Jahan does not die quietly. In the end she chose the rope of British law instead of the fire of Kali, and that, perhaps, is the only mercy this story contains." He turned to the Rani, who stood rigid as carved ivory. "Madame, your complicity was limited to the loan of a sari and a silence purchased by hatred of your husband. The political department will decide your fate. Major Dalrymple, your career ends here. The key, the loosened lattice, the lies about Bridge will follow you to a court-martial. Colonel Lacy, the weight discrepancy was never your doing, but your blindness was. Return to England and plant roses. You will never smell them again without remembering this night. Thakur Amar Singh, your debts will be paid by the sale of your horses and the loss of your expectations. The regency passes to the council under British supervision." He looked last at Soraya. "And you, mademoiselle, or should I say, your highness, will be taken to Ajmer jail to await trial. The evidence is complete. The ruby, the thread, the scent, the deposition of the gatekeeper, the hollow thrown leg, the cobra basket, the burned hand that tried to destroy the final proof. There will be no escape except the one you have already chosen. Soraya smiled then, a smile so radiant it silenced the hall. Escape? She said softly. I escaped the day I drove the dagger home. Everything after has been epilogue. She stepped forward, ignoring the sepoys, and knelt before the little prince on the balcony above. The child looked down at her with solemn, frightened eyes. "Wear it openly, little brother," she called, voice carrying to the furthest courtyard. "Wear the ruby in the sunlight, and let the curse die with me. Tell your children that once a woman loved her mother more than life, and paid the price so that they might live free of ghosts." She rose, turned to Poirot, and for a moment the chains seemed to fall away. "You were the only worthy adversary I ever met, little Belgian. When you are old and the mirrors no longer flatter, remember that once, in a crimson palace, a murderess saluted you." She bowed, not the stiff English curtsy she had used as Miss Marple, but the deep, graceful salaam of a Persian princess, then walked between her guards toward the great doors. The sepoys followed, uncertain whether they led a prisoner or escorted royalty. At the threshold, she paused, lifted the bandaged hand in farewell, and the scent of damask roses drifted back one last time, sweet, fatal, unforgettable. The doors closed. The ruby remained on its cushion, suddenly no more than a red stone in the morning light. Poirot stood motionless until the sound of chains faded along the corridor. Then he sighed, a small, precise exhalation that seemed to release the palace itself. "Come, Hastings," he said briskly. "The mail train to Delhi leaves in 2 hours, and I have developed a horror of curry. We shall breakfast on croissants and café au lait, and never speak of roses again." But as they walked away through corridors now bright with ordinary daylight, Hastings glanced back once. The mirrors of the Sheesh Mahal caught their departing figures and flung them into infinity two small men walking out of a story written in blood and perfume, and for an instant, in the furthest glass, he thought he saw a woman in grey cotton and crimson silk, smiling at something only she could see. He blinked, and the reflection was gone. Outside, the desert wind stirred the dust into small crimson whirlwinds that looked, from a distance, exactly like scattered petals.